George Harrison was known as the quiet Beatle. He rarely raised his voice, rarely confronted anyone directly, but silence doesn't mean agreement. Throughout the Beatles' career, George grew increasingly frustrated, not just with his lack of space as a songwriter, but with how Paul McCartney began to dominate the band's sound, structure, and studio atmosphere. While John Lennon argued openly, George absorbed resentment quietly. He played the parts. He followed instructions. But privately, certain Paul McCartney songs represented everything he disliked about where the Beatles were heading. These are 10 Paul McCartney songs George Harrison secretly hated, not because they were bad, but because they symbolized control, imbalance, and a band that no longer felt like a band. Number 10, When I'm 64, 1967.
When I get older, losing my head, many years.
George Harrison never publicly attacked When I'm 64, but his discomfort with the song was obvious. To him, it sounded like a throwback at a time when the Beatles were supposed to be moving forward. While the band was experimenting with psychedelia, Eastern philosophy, and sonic boundaries, Paul was writing a music hall tune about aging and domestic routine. George found the song trivial. The problem wasn't craftsmanship, it was relevance. Harrison felt Sgt. Pepper should represent expansion, not nostalgia. Songs like Within You Without You reflected his growing spiritual outlook, while When I'm 64 felt rooted in Paul's private nostalgia rather than the band's collective evolution. In the studio, George's role was minimal. The arrangement revolved around Paul's piano, clarinets, and tightly controlled structure. Harrison later hinted that tracks like this made him feel like a session musician rather than a creative partner. For George, When I'm 64 wasn't offensive, it was worse. It reminded him that Paul could steer the Beatles toward his personal taste, even when it felt completely out of step with where the band should have been going. Number 9. Maxwell's Silver Hammer, 1969.
Was quizzical, studied metaphysical science in
If there was one Paul McCartney song that tested George Harrison's patience to its limit, it was Maxwell's Silver Hammer. George later admitted, without naming names, that the recording sessions for this track were among the most miserable of his Beatles career. The issue wasn't just the song's darkly comic subject or its jaunty music hall tone, it was the process. Paul obsessed over every detail: the anvil strike, the backing vocals, the exact rhythmic feel. Takes dragged on for days while the band's morale collapsed. To George, it felt like perfectionism weaponized. Harrison believed the song symbolized how Paul had begun treating the Beatles like a backing band for his own ideas. George was told exactly what to play, and when not to play at all. There was little room for instinct or collaboration, just instructions. George later remarked that by this point, the Beatles no longer felt like a band making music together. They were individuals orbiting Paul's vision. Maxwell's Silver Hammer made that painfully clear. What frustrated George most was that the song wasn't essential. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't emotionally revealing. Yet it consumed time, energy, and goodwill the band no longer had to spare. To Harrison, the track wasn't merely annoying, it was a symbol of imbalance, and a warning sign that the Beatles' unity was already gone. Number 8. Obla Di, Obla Da, 1968. George Harrison's frustration with Obla Di, Obla Da wasn't subtle, it was simmering. To him, the song embodied a kind of forced cheerfulness that felt disconnected from where the Beatles actually were during the White Album sessions. While the band was emotionally fractured, Paul was pushing relentlessly for a song built on lightness, bounce, and relentless optimism. What truly irritated George was not the style itself, but the insistence. Paul drove the sessions hard, demanding retake after retake in pursuit of a very specific feel. Harrison later recalled that the atmosphere became toxic, joy manufactured through exhaustion. For George, that wasn't collaboration, it was coercion. Musically, George felt boxed in. His guitar parts were tightly prescribed, leaving little room for expression or spontaneity. The song didn't evolve organically. It was assembled piece by piece under Paul's direction. George reportedly grew so irritated that he deliberately played an aggressively loud piano part on one take, a small act of rebellion against what he saw as excessive control. To Harrison, obla di, obla da wasn't harmless fun. It was a symbol of imbalance, Paul dictating tone and process while others were expected to comply. The fact that the song became a worldwide hit only deepened the frustration. It confirmed George's fear that popularity was starting to outweigh partnership, and that the Beatles were no longer moving forward together. Number 7. The Long and Winding Road, 1970.
The long and winding road.
For George Harrison, The Long and Winding Road wasn't just a song. It was a symbol of how far the Beatles had drifted from being a band. Written by Paul during the Get Back period, the track emerged at a time when collaboration had already begun to collapse. What bothered George wasn't the melody or the emotion. It was the way the song was handled, and who controlled it. Paul treated the track as a personal statement, steering rehearsals with little room for others to shape the result. George's guitar contributions were minimal, almost incidental. The song didn't grow from group chemistry. It arrived nearly complete, waiting for the band to serve it. To George, that approach felt isolating. Things worsened after the sessions ended. When Phil Spector added lush orchestration without Paul's approval, the fallout fractured the band further. Paul was furious. John supported the changes. George stayed mostly silent, but privately, the episode confirmed his fears. Decisions were no longer shared. Power had replaced partnership. For Harrison, The Long and Winding Road captured the exhaustion of that era, a song about perseverance that revealed disconnection. Beautiful on the surface, but hollow behind the scenes. It wasn't that George hated the song itself. He hated what it represented, a band walking the same road, but no longer together. Number 6. Martha, My Dear, 1968.
Martha, my dear, though I spend my day.
For George Harrison, Martha, My Dear epitomized the quiet exclusion he felt during the White Album sessions. On paper, it was a charming piano piece with elegant chord changes and a stately arrangement. In practice, it barely required a band at all. And that was the problem. Paul recorded most of the track essentially alone. Piano, bass, vocal, and direction all flowed from him. An orchestral arrangement followed, precise and polished. George's involvement was minimal to non-existent. He wasn't arguing over parts or fighting for space. There simply wasn't any offered. To Harrison, songs like this signaled a shift from collaboration to authorship. The Beatles weren't discovering songs together anymore. They were being invited to participate, if needed. Martha, My Dear didn't sound like four musicians responding to one another. It sounded finished before anyone else arrived. That sense of redundancy cut deep. George had been writing stronger material than ever, yet found himself sidelined while Paul explored personal, self-contained ideas. The irony wasn't lost on him. A song named after a dog became a full Beatles production, while many of his own songs were dismissed or delayed. George never attacked Martha, My Dear publicly, but privately, it reinforced a painful realization. The band was no longer a shared instrument. It was becoming a platform, and George Harrison was being left off the stage. Number 5, Honey Pie, 1968.
She was a working girl.
For George Harrison, Honey Pie represented a kind of nostalgia he had already grown tired of, and a direction he felt the Beatles should have left behind. Written by Paul as a pastiche of 1920s music hall style, the song leaned heavily into old-world charm, theatrical vocals, and tightly arranged orchestration. George didn't hate the melody. He disliked the mindset. During the White Album sessions, Harrison was pushing forward, spiritually, musically, emotionally. He was writing songs that reflected inner change, restlessness, and search for meaning. Honey Pie, by contrast, felt like Paul looking backward, indulging in irony and style while the band itself was unraveling. The recording process only reinforced that frustration. Paul again took the lead, shaping the song around piano and orchestral textures. George's role was marginal, almost decorative. The song didn't invite interaction. It required obedience. To Harrison, it felt like another instance where the Beatles were being used to realize Paul's private interests rather than a collective vision. What made Honey Pie sting was its placement. Amid a sprawling, fractured album filled with tension, anger, and introspection, Paul insisted on perfecting a whimsical throwback. George saw it as emotional misalignment, cheerfulness imposed where honesty was needed. He never publicly condemned the song, but in hindsight, Honey Pie became part of a pattern George quietly resented: nostalgia over necessity, control over collaboration. To him, it wasn't harmless fun. It was a reminder that the band was no longer moving in the same direction. Number 4, She's Leaving Home, 1967.
Wednesday morning at 5 o'clock.
For George Harrison, She's Leaving Home was frustrating not because of its emotion, but because of how little space it left for a band. By the time the song was recorded, George felt the Beatles were drifting toward something increasingly rigid, songs arriving fully formed with roles already decided. Paul approached the track like a short film, a complete narrative, clear characters, carefully measured sentiment. George respected the writing, but he couldn't connect to the process. There were no guitars, no drums, no shared discovery in the studio, just Paul's voice, an orchestra, and a structure that didn't need anyone else. What irritated George most was Paul's decision to bypass George Martin and bring in an outside arranger. To Harrison, that move symbolized a deeper issue. Paul wasn't just directing the band, he was stepping outside it entirely when it suited him. The Beatles became optional. George believed the song observed emotion rather than lived inside it. While he was gravitating toward spiritual depth and internal struggle, She's Leaving Home felt detached, elegant, sympathetic, but distant. It told a story about someone else's pain instead of confronting the band's own. In the context of the White Album era, the song took on new meaning for George. It wasn't just about a girl leaving home, it sounded like an early warning of people quietly walking away while pretending everything was still fine. George didn't argue loudly over the track. He didn't need to. For him, She's Leaving Home confirmed a growing truth. The Beatles were no longer leaving together. Number 3, For No One, 1966.
Your day breaks, your mind aches, you find...
For George Harrison, For No One captured a version of the Beatles that no longer felt like a band at all. The song was intimate, precise, and emotionally controlled. Everything Paul McCartney valued at that stage. But for George, that control came at the expense of collaboration. Paul wrote the track as a deeply personal reflection on the end of a relationship. He approached it with a composer's mindset: piano-led structure, restrained vocal delivery, and a tightly scripted arrangement. The famous French horn solo wasn't discovered through group interplay. It was chosen, placed, and perfected. George had little to do. What frustrated Harrison was not the song's beauty, but its self-sufficiency. For No One didn't need the Beatles to exist. It could have been recorded by Paul alone, and functionally, it almost was. To George, this confirmed a pattern he increasingly resented: songs arriving finished with no room for instinct or exchange. At a time when Harrison was writing more expansive, exploratory material, For No One felt closed, controlled, final. It reflected Paul's growing confidence as an individual artist and the shrinking space for others inside the band. George never attacked the song publicly. He didn't have to. Its elegance said everything. For him, For No One wasn't just a breakup song. It was another quiet step away from being a group, toward being 4 separate voices sharing the same name. Number 2, Get Back, 1969. For George Harrison, Get Back was where frustration finally became visible. What was meant to be a return to basics, live playing, shared energy, no studio tricks, instead turned into a rehearsal room where Paul McCartney took command and everyone else followed. The song itself was simple, built around a blunt groove and a looping refrain. Paul treated that simplicity as an invitation to direct every detail. He told George what to play, how to play it, and when to stop. Cameras were rolling, tensions were high, and Harrison felt exposed, corrected in public, reduced to executing instructions rather than contributing ideas. This was the moment George snapped. His now famous line, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all," wasn't sarcasm, It was resignation. Get Back crystallized what George had been feeling for years. Paul wasn't collaborating anymore. He was leading, correcting, and shaping the band in his own image. To Harrison, the irony was painful. A song about returning to roots became proof that the band had lost them. Instead of rediscovering chemistry, Get Back revealed hierarchy. Authority replaced exchange. George briefly quit the band during these sessions. That decision didn't come from nowhere. It came from songs like Get Back, where the idea of the Beatles as equals finally collapsed. For George Harrison, this wasn't just a song he disliked. It was the breaking point. Number 1, Let It Be, 1970.
When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary.
For George Harrison, Let It Be was the final contradiction. A song about peace that was born from control, exhaustion, and quiet resentment. On the surface, it sounded comforting. Gentle piano, gospel phrasing, a message of acceptance. But behind the sound, George heard something else entirely. By the time Let It Be took shape, the band was barely functioning as a unit. Paul was driving the sessions, determined to impose calm through structure. George, meanwhile, felt invisible. He contributed one of his most expressive guitar solos, restrained, emotional, and perfectly placed, only to watch it altered, replaced, and later reshaped without his consent during post-production. To Harrison, that change symbolized everything that had gone wrong. The song no longer felt like a shared statement. It felt authored, owned, and finalized by one voice. Paul spoke of surrender, let it be, but George experienced the opposite. There was no letting go in the studio. There was only insistence. What made it painful was the song's legacy. Let It Be became a global anthem, praised for its serenity and wisdom. Yet for George, it marked the end of dialogue. The band had stopped listening to one another. He never denied the song's power, but power to him was not the same as unity. For George Harrison, Let It Be wasn't ruined musically. It was ruined by what it proved, that the Beatles could sound peaceful, even as they fell apart.